Thank you so much to the worship team. We're drawing closer to the end of the series we've been going through in the book of Acts. Can you believe that we've been on this? I think it's about 28 weeks. Somewhere around there, 29 weeks. So we're on to chapter 27 now. Call it the perfect tempestuous storm. Probably wondering what on earth does that word mean. I found it on Google. It means violent, basically. In the passage, it talks about that the wind was of hurricane strength, but the translators used that word hurricane because we identify with hurricane, but the word is actually tempestuous. And you'll see the painting that's behind there. It was by Ludolf Buckhazen. It used to hang in the Ostfriesen Landmuseum in Emden. It now hangs in our spa and frigarium at home, along with many other pieces of artwork, which none of you have yet seen in person. Any of you know what a frigarium is? It's a swimming pool. You get to learn lots of things here at church. Do you trust God's plan for your life? It's comfortable to say that when life is calm and life is easy and everything's in order, but how about it when life takes on that turn that it looks like it's collapsing and everything is collapsing around you, and life takes on the form of a tempestuous storm? Do you trust God for His plan for our life? I know in those moments when life takes on that form of that tempestuous storm, I personally begin to doubt and question and kick against God and panic and ask whether He's there and doubt Him and run around in a circle in a panic. Do you do that? Or am I the only one? Okay, yes, we do that. It seems to be what happens. And there are times that these tempestuous storms come upon us. The nice thing, or the beautiful, the magnificent thing you see within this congregation is that when somebody is going through a tempestuous storm, how the congregation surrounds that person, prays for them, helps them through those times. And so just for that, to say thank you. Thank you for being that kind of loving, caring congregation who do engage in that way. And I know there are some who are going through a difficult time at the moment and are experiencing God's hand and the congregation surrounding them. Well, a tempestuous storm is the perfect setting for God to use to be able to reveal Himself. Many of us pray for what we would call lazy boy or armchair Christianity. So long as everything is perfect, runs perfectly, and there are no problems whatsoever, thank you, Lord, now everything's great and I'm blessed. Well, you're not going to learn much about God in those situations. You need to see when we are faced with life-threatening situations or life-threatening illnesses, it's in those moments that we really do draw close to God, that we learn so much about Him, that we throw off that, because usually we cast a wide beam of of where we gather information, all on the frill sides of Christianity, all the nice to know things, the things that we can easily share with each other. And we come right down, almost in laser precision, focus upon the gospel. And there are times that God says, forget about the frills. That doesn't save you. Come back to the gospel. That's the important part. And in suffering, that's what the Lord does. He draws us right in. We learn valuable lessons about His nature, about His character, about His desire to be in relationship with us, His commitment to us, His commitment to revealing Himself, and to come to not just know about Him, but to really know Him. The frills of the things, we get to know a lot about stuff. But in those moments when we've got to come with that laser point as a laser beam where we focus so closely upon the gospel, that's when we learn to know God, to really know Him. Now Luke, when he wrote Acts, took time to record this situation of this storm that happened at sea. He takes a fairly lengthy period of time to describe it. And as I was going through this passage over and over, reading through it, I was thinking, how on earth am I going to squeeze a sermon out of this? This is one of those difficult passages. And then I'm thinking, well, if he has spent close to 24 verses talking about the storm, there's obviously something that is going on here. He wouldn't just dedicate that amount of time to this event if it was pointless. So let's have a look at what's going on here, because in the end we will see that it was the perfect tempestuous storm, where 276 passengers' lives are in grave danger, and yet Paul, and I guess many others along on that ship, discovered much about God. There's a map I want to go up on the screen. You'll see this map that will go up now. Normally in those days when they sailed, they hugged close to the coast. Because the reason being is that if anything went wrong in terms of your rations or anything went wrong in terms of your boat, you wanted to know that you could see the coastline and that you could make a quick turn in. It was only actually after 1450 that they began to have this idea of sailing in the open where you didn't really see the coastline. So it's a fairly recent thing of going out into deep water. But you can see them as they move from Caesarea all the way up around past Turkey, back down to Crete, island hopping along, and then something happens just after Crete. And that's what Luke wants us to know. So Paul and some other prisoners are handed over to a centurion by the name of Julius, who was presently serving in the imperial regiment, a particular regiment of the Roman army. They boarded the ship in Caesarea, and they took the normal maritime route. You see that on the map, that they were going to be heading for Rome. What they would have done is that after Crete, they would have gone north up to Corinth or to Greece, gone along the coast, and then hopped across to Italy and come back down again in order to get to Rome. That would have been the normal route. When they get to Turkey, to the area known as Pamphylia, they change ships to an Alexandrian ship, and Luke tells us that they changed to an Alexandrian ship. Now, this was a ship coming from Egypt. Uh, Several years back, there had been two major famines in the Roman Empire, and Claudius Caesar had now commissioned that there needed to be reliable sea routes to move grain around the empire. And shipbuilders were given incentives from Rome to build bigger, larger ships, ships that were able to handle stronger weather, and ships that were able to sail even in the winter seasons. Now, in the winter seasons, the sea was incredibly rough, but they were given incentives for that. Plus, they were also insured that should a ship sink, they got their money back, because they didn't want a repeat of loss of food around the empire. So they get onto one of these larger ships, and we hear that there's 276 passengers aboard this ship. It's a large ship. It's carrying a lot of passengers. But now there's two complications that are happening with regards to this situation. The first is that it's a privately owned ship that is under Roman authority, and there is a time frame that they've got to get from Egypt to Rome. There's an incentive. It's not just the salary. They're going to get an incentive for getting that grain there quickly. The second complication, there's prisoners on board, state prisoners, guarded by Roman soldiers. If at any stage any of these prisoners escaped, it's on the head of the Roman soldier. They will be executed. When they arrive at port and they say, "Where's your prisoner?" and they go, "Off with his head." Basically. So they wanted to get to Rome as quickly as possible. This is a situation that's happening. So when they leave Pamphylia, Luke tells us that they struggled along with the wind because they were already entering into the winter season. So the trade winds are not on their side, so they're losing time. They're running behind time. And you can imagine now that the incentive the ship owner is going to get when he gets to the other side is going to be diminishing. He wants to make sure he's going to get his full amount of money. So they struggling to make headway. They come down to Crete. They're going to be picking up things at Crete. And let's read here and pick up now from Acts 27, verse 9. It says, "Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement," just given the time of year, and so that as to understand the weather. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, and the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. Okay, I want to pop up another map just of Crete. Now, you can see in the middle of the island, there's a place called Fair Havens. That's where they stopped. They wanted to make a short trip of 46 miles to Phoenix. Why? And just wait there. The desire for the incentive, the financial incentive, and so on, all this is pushing. The fact that there are state prisoners on board, all this is pushing, and they want to push 46 miles further and then wait for the winds to be able to change in order to sail up to Greece. But now there's a problem. If you look on the map where it says Crete, you'll see that there are two mountain peaks. Between that, they call it 10-mile gap. If the wind changed and came from the northeast, it would compress into those two mountain peaks, into that valley known as the Mazzara Valley. and would cause the wind to pump really hard as to hurricane strength. And it was so strong that it could blow them so far south as to hit in the coast of North Africa. That's how strong that wind would be. So now they decide, under the duress, they're actually going to make a run for it, past the 10-mile gap. That's what they're going to do now. Let's pick up the account now. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. This wind comes up. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so they gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of the small island, Corda, there's a small island off Crete, they went down below that. We were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. You can see there's a problem already starting to happen. This is the scene that Luke's building. Because they were afraid that they were going to run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. I'll show you on a map where that is in a few moments. They lowered the sea anchor to let the ship be driven along. In other words, they were trying to put brakes on. Hold the ship together, trying to put the brakes on. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day we began to throw cargo overboard. Okay, pull that map up. There's Libya. The sandbars of Syrtis, just off Libya. They are blown to Libya. This is frightening. I want you to just for a moment, this is why Luke is putting this in. This is frightening. You get caught in this wind and you are blown. And this is not just a flat sea. This will create monster waves. They've bound the ship together. They're throwing cargo overboard. They've put the anchors down, dragging along the bottom to try to act as a brake, and they are blown so far south. Any of you ever been in a very rough sea? When I was serving as a port chaplain back in South Africa, when the guys when the ships would round the Cape, or the Eastern Cape, there were at times that the ship would get caught on two crests. And the danger was that there would be no water below the bottom, and the ship could actually just snap in half. And talking to some of the salvage divers, that they would say they would dive on some of these ships that had been caught there, and they would find the captain and the pilot still in their seat as the ship had snapped in half and had gone down like a diving submarine, and the captain and the pilot killed with the impact of the water, but still in their seat. It was frightening. And I would ask these guys, who are seasoned sailors, are you afraid when you come round that coast and they say, we are petrified? We are fearing for our lives. Let's pick up what the passage says. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. That's in order to allow the ship to be able to sail. All your ropes and so. This is now a situation that is so desperate, they're not going to be able to sail properly. All the ship's tackle goes overboard. They threw it over with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, the storm continued raging, and we finally gave up hope of being saved. This is a horrible situation. The ship is buffeted for 14 days, just continuously being buffeted. If you've been out on the sea and you see little white horses coming up, and you sailing back in, you bouncing across, and it's not very pleasant, and you may have had the privilege of hanging over the edge. I know I've had the privilege of hanging over the edge on some occasions, and it's not pleasant. 14 days, continuous storm, fighting to keep the ship afloat, fighting to keep it together. And you've got 276 passengers, most of whom are paying passengers. This captain, the pilot, and Julius, he's named, just so as to shame him. Can you imagine the kind of anger that would have been towards them? Imagine the panic, the crying. Horrible, fearful. And we read, we'll see this in a moment, Paul himself was afraid. The first time we read in Scripture, he was afraid. Let's pick it up. Verse 22. But Paul speaking to the centurion, the pilot, and to various others. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul." Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So in the midst of this tempestuous storm, we've got to ask ourselves the question, what mindset was Paul approaching this with? Yes, he was afraid. Yes, an angel came and encouraged him. But we must always remember that there are going to be times when we are going to face these tempestuous storms. And this comes as a reminder to ensure us and ask ourselves the question, what are we studying and reading and taking into our minds and feeding ourselves with? If we are not feeding ourselves with the gospel, I can guarantee you, and I've seen this in close to 3 decades of ministry, I can guarantee you, if you have not focused on the gospel during the fat years, when the lean years come and the tempestuous storm hits, you will be blown right off course. I have seen from congregation members to pastors leave the faith in a moment when a tempestuous storm has hit, because they were feeding on peripheral issues and not the gospel. Feed on the gospel. That is your only anchor line that the Lord has given. Paul knew he belonged to the Lord. He was able to write, if we live, we live for the Lord. If we die, we die for the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord. For this reason, Christ died and returned to life so that we might be with the Lord, both in the dead and the living. You can see the gospel. Whether it's life or death, he knows it's the gospel holding him. He was able to say right at the end of his life, I have finished this race. It was a difficult race. I have finished this race. I have kept the faith. I've kept it. And now what is in store for me is a crown of righteousness. Can we say that? Because all it needs is the perfect tempestuous storm. And we'll leave the faith. Don't ever say, I'll never leave it. Because that perfect tempestuous storm that comes along, that knocks you and I straight off our own pedestal, can knock us straight out of church. Straight out. Because the question will be, well, where's God in the midst of this? This God that I've served for all these years, where is He? And when you don't have the answer, because the answer is found in the gospel. It's found nowhere else. It's found in the gospel. In the Old Testament. That when, and we see so many times how they wrestled with this question. Where are you, God, in the midst of crisis? Where are you? They faced crises of untenable situations. Regular passages that were quoted were from the prophet Habakkuk, Psalm 73, or Job. Just briefly looking at those, the psalmist in Psalm 73, when he talks about saying that my feet almost slipped. Don't ever say, I will never leave the Lord. The psalmist said, my feet almost slipped. I was right there. I was right at that moment. My feet nearly went. But what held him? He says, till I entered the sanctuary of God, then I understood my final destiny. When I entered there, what did he see there? He says, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. How did he know that? By getting in there with the Lord. Spending time with Him. Spending time to get to know His character and His nature. If you were given a moment where you were asked the question by somebody who said, describe to me what God is like, would you be able to do that? I'm not asking you from an intellectual level. Well, I read this book, I read that book, or so on. I'm asking you from an experiential level. Can you do that? Well, Job, fascinating book. When the news comes to him that he's lost everything, including his family, the only thing that's left for him is his wife, who moans the whole time. That in itself just seemed like it would have been the worst punishment. Everything else was just easy. To have her just constantly in the background moaning at him. Notice what Job says. It says, at this Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, and then he fell down in worship. What did he know about God? The prophet Habakkuk. That devastation that had happened to Israel and Jerusalem. It was harsh. When you go and read it in its technicolor, and one of the nice things we get to do on the Thursday Bible studies, and I really just use this as a bit of a advert, as if you're watching Channel 7, there's those adverts, just invade your privacy. They're great for a toilet break or a coffee break. That's about as good as they are. But you get one of those, this is one of those advert moments. In those Thursday Bible studies, we get the moment to dissect Scripture, to go and look at the background and to see what's really going on so it comes alive. With the wonderful technology of YouTube, it's now on YouTube. But Habakkuk saw some of the most horrendous and horrible things happening in front of him. He writes at one stage, he says, Lord, after all of this crisis, he says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day, and in our time, make them known. Another time he says, Sovereign Lord, in my strength. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. He knew the Lord. Knew him. We get into the New Testament. Sounds like we're going to go through 39 books of the New Testament. No, we promise you won't do that. There's just one very special sign that is given in the midst of extreme suffering. Extreme suffering where it just feels as though everything can just fall apart. The sign is given. Emmanuel. God with us. God He's a faithful, covenanting God who would himself take on human flesh and dwell with us. And he comes to us and he journeys with us. So now what gave Paul that strength to know that in the midst of a perfect tempestuous storm, where it just seemed this was it, on that boat, God's with me. He has spoken to me. Worship team can start coming up. He has spoken to me. He's with me. Let's read the last few verses of chapter 27. We see the outcome. When daylight came, this is after 14 days, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept him from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to the land, and the rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of ship. In this way, everyone reached the land safely. And next week we find out where they landed and the miracle of what that ensued. Let's worship the Lord.